right, I'm sure there's going to be some people trickling in as we start this morning. My name is Jessica Crowley. I'm one of the instructors today. I will be manning the chats, and Denise is going to be the presenter. Please feel free to raise your hands. We've got our notifications sorted by that, so if you have any type of issue or you'd like to unmute and speak up about a topic, please raise your hand and we'll make sure we get to you. One of the cool things about today that's very different from maybe other webinars you've been to is we have a number of topics for you guys to vote on and choose the ones that are most relevant to you. And then we'll focus our time box and our energy on covering those topics and answering some of your application questions that you might have. So I think you're going to find this to be a very valuable time. What I'm really excited about the fact that you're going to get a chance to weigh in on the content. So we have a slide deck in front of us, and we'll be going through that today. We'll also have a combination of discussion along the way. I might chat some information to you if you have specific questions, and I can send you links to articles and documents that will be happening in the chat. And then we'll also send you out about an hour after the webinar is finished, a recording of this whole entire series so that you can see for yourself later on, maybe want to refer to one of the topics that we covered, and maybe you have questions for us later. So we're going to also provide you with our contact information so you can follow up with us. So yeah, hopefully by now you've gotten in and you have audio connection and you're ready to go. So we are expecting about 130 people today, so we might see people trickle in as we go. All right, Denise, over to you. Oh, Denise, you're muted. Nope, you're still muted. So while you're trying to figure out how to unmute, I can introduce myself. Okay, so my name is Jessica Crowley. As I said, I'm one of the instructors. I'm an enterprise agile coach, which means I travel to lots of different types of organizations, from the commercial sector to the government sector to even the nonprofit sector. And I train and certify others in Scrum. But what's really cool about me is that I've lived through an agile transformation, and I have the scars to show it and the glory that comes with that too. So I have been on an adventure the last almost 7 years, to going from traditional program management background to background of agility. And along the way, I have gotten to grow from being a Scrum Master on one of the first beta teams at the company I was working for to becoming an Agile coach and traveling to our sites and spreading the best practices. I have seen so much success with what Agile can do, and I've also seen a lot of the difficulties. I think what's unique about Denise and I are it's that we're not scared of the topic of integrating the traditional side of your functions and your businesses with the agile side of your company. And I will say that we have lots of tips and tricks that we've found that are proven, and we can also help you avoid some of the pitfalls that are out there, so you can save some of that precious time on your agile journey. Okay, so Denise, do you have? No, we cannot hear you still. Denise, we can't hear you. Anyways, well, Denise is still working on that. So, I mean, I can introduce Denise for you. So I'll have her call in real quick so that she has audio. But while she's doing that, let me tell you a little bit about Denise and how I met her. Denise is actually an amazing enterprise agile coach with a rich background in the Department of Defense and in the government sector. So Denise has, she's prior military intelligence officer. She was in the military for quite some years and ended up working for a company called Northrop Grumman. She came to work for the company I was working at when she was taking a break from being a road warrior in the consulting world for earned value. And one of the cool things I really respect about Denise is that when she came into our organization, she helped transform our PMO to an agile PMO, and really helped us get a handle on getting the types of metrics and insight that we needed to get out of our projects that were agile. So Denise and I work really well together. And when she gave me a call saying she was, back at Humphreys and Associates and she wanted to launch this new branch of our company called Radically Better Agile, I was super excited to have this opportunity and to work with her to form, the company that we have right now. So here we are together, getting ready to give you guys a chance. There's like 61 of you right now, and I'm going to chat a poll where you can have, you can select the top 3 topics that you would like to cover today. And what's going to happen? Oh, okay. You can hear Denise, but I can't hear Denise. Oh, okay. All right, great. So, well, I've introduced her, and hopefully you could hear me the whole time. So when we go through the poll unit, you will get to select the top 3 topics. And then once you've done that, we will cover those topics extensively, and then we'll remove them from the list. So the next time you come to the webinar, there'll be a smaller pool for you to vote on, and then so on and so forth until we've completed that. All right, so everyone can hear Denise except for me. And I'm going to chat you guys that poll now. Let's see if I can get it to go. All right, so just go into click on the link and anonymously select the top 3 topics that are most relevant to you. Don't forget to scroll to the right because there are 20 different topics to choose from. All right, and we'll give you guys a few minutes to pull that up. And Denise, I guess I'll dial in because I can't hear you. Yep, exactly. So that's exactly what we'd like you to do is take the URL that I just typed in and open another tab, type it in, and then you're going to see the options available. You'll be able to select a green checkbox. We'd like you to select 3 of those topic areas that are most important to you, and it automatically tallies who's voting. So we can see where the most popular topics are. Denise? Okay, let's check in.
You'll know what is the most important topic to you in just a minute here, and then we'll get started with the content. Someone said, where do I add a new tab? You can just click the link in the chat, and it should bring up the poll for you. Or you can just bring up a new browser and copy and paste that link into that new browser.
I see we have a few hands up. I don't know if they still have questions, but William and Joy.
Okay, Joy's is still up. Joy, do you have a, oh, no.
Okay.
Great. Must have solved it. Have most people voted, Jessica?
They have. Most people have.
Okay, great.
I'm just tallying it up and looking at it now. All right, so as of right now, Denise, it looks like developing a product backlog and integrating with EVMS is the #1 choice.
Great, okay. Let me get to that section then. This is kind of exciting for us too. We don't know what we're going to talk about yet. All right, so it sounds like we'll start with this section, developing a product backlog and integrating with EVMS. All right, the first thing that Jessica and I typically do when we're on site with our clients and they are thinking about developing a product using Agile and some type of Agile approach, we like to start with the product vision. I think that getting everybody around a product vision that they can really see and understand the why they're doing work is incredibly important. So this is kind of a vanilla example of one that we actually did use with one of our clients. And this is a template that you could use if you're developing a product vision with your organization. So 4 warfighters who need to detect, locate, and direct fire at enemy ground targets. The Death Star vehicle is an unmanned ground vehicle that is controlled by a ground operator during day or night operations. Unlike the Titan unmanned ground vehicle, our product has increased survivability, minefield transit capabilities, laser-directed attack functionality, heightened system security, and increased operational speed to safely and securely support the mission. So you can see that it's pretty concise. Typically, we get the leaders of this product or project together, a lot of the product owners or potentially SMEs, subject matter experts, and other people who might become the product owner. And we have this discussion, we facilitate the discussion with them. Usually we put a lot of stickies on the wall and just talk about what is it really that we're trying to build. And we come up with something like this that we keep very visible. We post it on the wall of the war room or Agile area that we'll be working in. And it just kind of brings everybody together and makes sure that everybody understands at the high level, you know, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And then as we start to form teams, then they develop a nested vision that always supports the overarching product vision. All right. The next step really that we do is we start brainstorming and we start to develop the backbone of the roadmap from that product vision. So we start to talk about what are the highest levels or subsystems, what are the components that you would really need to develop this product. And we start to break that down into a smaller subset of the product. Sometimes we refer to this as epics or capability groups. And then we break it down even further into something that you might call features. So we're really decomposing that product from the highest level vision. We're breaking it down into work that we know our Agile teams can execute. And we're starting to build a roadmap. We're starting to build the backlog of work that our teams are going to accomplish. And in the end, we end up with something that it might look like this. It might be on the wall. It might be in an Agile tool. But we lay across all of those epics and features and groups of capability that we've determined that we're going to build across time. And we make sure that we're going to be able to accomplish all of this work within the specific time to meet our milestones or releases. So we like to say you can call it what you want. You can call it epic, you can call it features. Jessica and I really call it those things because it's in alignment with the NDIA Agile Guide, which is probably the best place to look for an Agile and EVMS reference guide. But it's unlike some other things like more traditional ways of doing project management or earned value management, where the language is very specific. In Agile, it's not as specific, and you can really call it what you want, as long as you convey that across your organization, come to internal agreement, so that everybody is speaking that same language. And so if I say epic, everybody knows what that means, or if I'm calling it a version, then everybody understands what that is. And that also needs to be written down in your process. And also, you need to inform your customer about that language. So once you've organized your work, you've decided how you're going to decompose and break down the work, you determined the nomenclature or what you're going to call it, then you can start to talk to the customer about your process and about the way that you've organized your product backlog and roadmap.
I also put a link inside of the chat for the NDIA Agile Guide. If you've never heard of that before, we recommend you reading that.
Awesome. So if we go with this nomenclature, subsystems, epic, and feature, we'll use that throughout today's training, then you can see that this forms our product backlog. So our product backlog is all of the scope that we know needs to be completed to accomplish this work, to make this product or complete this project. If you're using an earned value management system and you have something like a work breakdown structure, then your product backlog has to align with that work breakdown structure. You have to be satisfied and understand that you have all of the scope that's in that WBS, at least the part that will be conducted using Agile development approaches in your product backlog. So if you're doing Agile and EV, it's really important that you have this type of alignment and that you can point to what parts of the product backlog satisfy your WBS.
I think you have a question,
and in addition,
Calvin. Sorry.
Okay, great. What's the question?
Raised hand. So, hey, Calvin, did you have a question about this topic? All right.
Maybe not.
Okay,
That's okay. Feel free to speak up. Feel free to chat if you do have a question, Calvin. Hopefully you can hear us and see everything okay. So in the product backlog, it's also important to know that not only is it in alignment with your work breakdown structure and work breakdown structure dictionary, it's also important that you understand what statement of work is covered where. So typically we want to ensure that the control account managers and Agile teams understand what part of this statement of work is covered in the product backlog. So something that Jessica and I find almost every time we go into an organization is a Waterfall WBS, and our clients really want to be Agile. They, they're in different stages of their Agile maturity or their Agile journey, you could say. But what often happens is that they have these big government contracts, they have an earned value management requirement, and they receive some type of traditional or waterfall from their customer, and they have to figure out what to do with that and how they can still really take advantage of using an Agile development approach and becoming more Agile within the way that they're doing work, and still satisfy, the government requirements that they have. And how do they break down this work from the Waterfall WBS into Agile Teams is something that Jessica and I spend a lot of time working with our clients to figure out. So if you receive a Waterfall WBS, then it's important that you map that product backlog back to the scope in the WBS. I mentioned that all of the scope should be covered in the product backlog, and it does just require a little bit of tick and tying or mapping back to that WBS. So for example, if you wanted to understand where the suspension and steering development effort was taking place in the backlog, then I would expect that the control account manager specifically, and also potentially the product owners would understand that the steering 1.1.5 in the WBS is being developed under a specific epic or feature in the product backlog. And I would expect that they would be able to map back and show me that traceability so that I know as internal controls or a government auditor, etc., that they would know where the scope is in the backlog. I will say though that especially different sectors within the government, they're moving much more towards agility. We're seeing a lot of good things happening in the government, and we're not always seeing waterfall WBSs being handed down. The slide that we have here is an example taken from the Office of Acquisition Analytics and Policy, which used to be PARCA. Their guide shows that there's an original waterfall development oriented hierarchy that shows like your typical CSCI requirements analysis, then doing the design, then doing the test. But they also have published an outcome-based agile structure example, which is acceptable to government contracts that typically have your MIL standard 881 type WBS. And in this, it shows a prime mission subsystem, just the same as in the previous example, but the work is organized differently. It's organized into capabilities or epics and features. So we are seeing a mix of both, but oftentimes our clients do have to do this mapping because they've received a very waterfall WBS. So this is an example. A lot of the training that Jessica and I do, we talk about drones, we talk about unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned ground vehicle systems. So this is an example that we created for our Vader contract, and it just shows that it is a capability-based or outcome-based work breakdown structure. And the same for the WBS dictionary. So it's possible to have a waterfall WBS or an outcome-based WBS and still be agile and still be compliant with earned value management. So this is an example taken from an agile tool. This is out of a JIRA application. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with JIRA. You might use other agile tools as well. But what we wanted to show you here is that in JIRA, there are a lot of fields that you can customize to identify things like your statement of work paragraph, your work breakdown structure. You can also add in things like requirements, at least if you decide to do that. You can also keep some of these things offline. And one of the other topics that Jessica and I can dive into deeper if you choose is requirements, because that's another area where we get a lot of questions about, wait a minute, how do you handle requirements if you're agile, and where is that traceability? So we can definitely dig deeper into that topic as well. But the idea here is that through all of the documentation, from earned value management all the way into the agile tools such as JIRA, we want to have the scope traceability, and it's possible to do that because JIRA has a lot of fields, as do the other agile tools, that allow you to customize and tie back. We recommend doing that at least at the in here version or epic, or you could call it capability, epic, and feature level. We like to see that traceability. So it's pretty easy to do, and that way you can demonstrate that you are, you have that traceability back to your earned value management system, and it alleviates a lot of questions and uncertainty around the requirements in the SAL. Because a lot of times Jessica and I go in to organizations and they are very agile and they're, producing working product and things seem to be going well, but it's a little difficult to show if they're actually completing the work that's in the contract to a T. All right, the next slide here talks about the integrated master plan, and this is all about traceability again. So in the beginning, I briefly talked to you about developing a product roadmap and the fact that we've organized the work into releases across time. And this is to demonstrate that the product roadmap should map to your integrated master plan. In other words, just because you're agile doesn't mean that you don't have a contractual obligation to complete a specific set of scope by a certain time, especially on these government contracts that are very large and complex. So in this case, we're just looking at increment 1 release, And you can see that increment 1 release is not only on the integrated master plan that we've received and developed with our customer, but also it's in the product roadmap. So I, as a product owner or an Agile team, can see that I'm on track or not on track to delivering the scope that I've agreed to with my customer by that particular release 1 date. All right, customers here, we have questions.
Yeah, something I wanted to share that I was reading in the chats was a really good point that someone just made, that if the customer is focusing on a detailed statement of work and requirements, then they don't really want a true Agile program, they want a hybrid. And I will say, just in alignment with that concept, that we do often see that it's the upfront and the very waterfall setup that sometimes it just handicaps the prime contractors from truly being Agile. And they can do a lot to cope with that. We found a lot of like coping mechanisms for how they can try to protect their agility, but there is still some I don't want to know, limitations that are imposed when a customer isn't using more of an Agile approach to begin with. So I would say it's actually additional effort, and it's increased scope for that prime contractor to spend all that time mapping and lining things up to a very waterfall way. But Denise and I have seen a huge increase, like a marked increase in customers, the government reaching out to people like me and saying, hey, can we have a little bit of training so that we can get better written contracts in place, and how we can encourage agility on these contracts. So I just wanted to comment on that and share that little feedback. So thank you, and keep the comments coming. If you'd like it to be anonymous, like I just shared it, then just private message it to me, and I'll make sure I don't say your name.
Yeah, I see another one too that says requirements is a focus for my management. I completely agree. This is a really touchy subject. That's why we bring it up. That's why we talk about requirements, because yeah, depending on how agile your customer is and the type of relationship that the contractor has with especially the government customer, yes, requirements can be touchy, and it's sometimes difficult if the customer is not completely on board with the agile approach that the contractor is taking. So I agree. I think you have very good points. All right, we'll keep it going. So in the spirit of government is moving much more towards agility, Jessica and I wanted to share this with you. Maybe you've seen it before. This comes from the latest update to the DoD 5000 series, which if you're especially in Department of Defense government contracting work, you are probably familiar. But what you might not have seen yet is that this has been updated to include much more agile approaches, such as especially in the software acquisition piece. It doesn't technically say agile here, but you can see that it's got this little circle with an arrow, which is an image that represents agility. It represents iterative development. It represents things like Scrum being used. It talks about having a minimum viable product or a minimum viable capability release, MVCR and MVP. So that's great. The government is starting to understand that and actually wants our contractors to become more agile, because there's so much benefit from using this approach. We'll talk about the benefits, in other sections, but reduced risk, more communication with the customer, more innovative products, testing more frequently. So Jessica and I are really happy to see some of these Department of Defense policies and guidance that are moving more towards agility. You can also see that there's rapid prototyping, rapid fielding. Those types of things are also good to include for teams that are, becoming more agile and using agile for hardware, for example. And hopefully things like this will help customers and contractors be in more alignment with the contractor's agile approach. One of the other things that Jessica and I get asked all the time, especially when you do have a more waterfall or traditional type of contract and you're trying to become more agile, is how do you handle things like technical reviews, systems engineering technical reviews, like when you have very specific requirements in your customer documentation, such as preliminary design review, critical design review, all these different reviews that I'm showing here on this slide. So we see a lot of different approaches. I will say that this particular concern, you have to talk to your customer. You have to communicate with your customer, and hopefully you can present an approach which is more iterative. So, for example, you could still have some of these technical reviews, which are really important to make sure that your product is a good product, but you can do it more iteratively. So, in other words, inviting your customer to some of these test reviews and different technical reviews for just release 1, documenting that for release 1, and then adding on or layering on the new development work for release 2, and then doing another round or iterative review with your customer at that time. So I know that this is a kind of a small slide, but it's showing that there's different sprints within each of the releases. You're demonstrating the work to your internal customers or your internal stakeholders and customers if possible. And then at the end of the release, you've accomplished or satisfied some of these requirements for joint reviews with your customer. So we are seeing more contractors working with their customers to do a much more iterative way of technical review in this lower portion of the slide, like the Agile model that I'm demonstrating. So as I mentioned, it's important, especially for those technical reviews, but just in general, if you're moving towards agility, that you communicate with your customer. I think that that's something that when Jessica and I talk to our government civilians or people on the customer side, sometimes they don't actually realize and understand that if your contractor is more agile, that means you have to communicate with your contractors more. So when we're on site with our contractor clients, we tell them that it's actually best to engage with the customer prior to IBR. So if you have an integrated baseline review coming up, we definitely want you to talk to your customer about your Agile approach, talk about the things that we showed at the very beginning, like how you've architected the product, how you've decomposed the work into epics or features, some of the naming conventions and language that you've come up with, and also what is their level of interaction supposed to be. If you're doing a more iterative technical review, then are you expecting them to come to your release backlog reviews or your demos? What is their level of interaction? Maybe it is the system level demos and technical reviews, or maybe it's something more often, like maybe they're actually going to be the product owner or they're embedded with your Scrum teams. The main reason, though, is really just to get feedback, to make sure that they're on the same page, to make sure that it's a collaborative environment, and to get their feedback on how are things going, what is the feedback on the product that you're demonstrating, and making sure that they're on the same page with what is in the backlog. For example, what's in the backlog for the next release. And then we also get a lot of questions about who is the right person for the product owner, and should that be perhaps somebody on the customer side. We see both. I would say most often or more often than not, the customer is not the product owner, but we have seen that happen and we have seen it work really well. I would say that there's some pros, some cons of having the customer as product owner. Obviously, if your customer is the product owner, they're very engaged in what's in the backlog, doing the prioritization, they're assisting in the demos and reviewing the work. But on the other hand, maybe there's some concerns about scope creep or what exactly is in the backlog and what has the contractor signed up to do versus what's contractually obligated. So there's pros and cons.
We just got a great question from Roberta Martin. So I understand the iterative development approach and how it enhances the potential quality and speed of execution and delivery. But how does keeping the requirements and acceptance criteria fluid prevent feature creep and the potential to exceed contract budgets and scope without having formal documentation and reviews? Wow, that's a very good question and loaded.
Yeah.
We actually don't have any requirement slides in this section, but I will say we do have a whole section that's focused on requirements because in my experience, requirements don't just go away. Because you're agile doesn't equal no requirements. And in particular, for a lot of the products that I made at my company when we were going through an agile transformation, when you have that many Scrum teams that are creating products, you need to have some type of high-level requirements that define the overall product architecture, and then you need to have requirements that define the modules that you're developing, and the key interfaces between those modules need to be established in the form of requirements. The reason you need those requirements is so that a Scrum team can work on a module and make changes within that module even late in the development cycle without impacting the overall system. And also with regards to that, acceptance criteria, for those of you that don't know what that is, that closely aligns with the requirements. It is basically a technical description of what's the test that you need to pass when you're done with that product, and how do you prove that it's truly done. Those should relate to your requirements and satisfy those requirements. There's a relationship that's very clear between those two. So one of the ways that we prevent scope creep is by clearly defining the acceptance criteria when we're road mapping. Road mapping is a process that should be done, and I encourage it at the beginning of a program and then refreshed throughout the life of that contract. It's good for you to establish the acceptance criteria and definition of done so that it's crystal clear from the beginning what it's going to take for you to meet that description of done. What are the tests you need to pass? That allows your teams to size better, and it helps ensure that later on when you start adding new requirements in there, it's very clear that you're adding additional scope. So we don't write all of the requirements. I do not recommend you do big design up front. I recommend you do just enough for your Agile teams to start experimenting and getting to work. And then what I recommend is that at a modular level, those requirements are more organically evolved as your teams experiment and test out the concepts for how they're actually going to get those modules to function within the parameters that you've established and with the relationships that they have. So I would highly recommend. I have a couple of things I'll send you to, some links to our web pages and stuff. I'll message those to you, and you're more than welcome to check those out. And then don't forget, we do have a whole section where I talk about product architecture, designing more modular, both software and hardware designs, and then how to incorporate requirements. So those concepts are in there, but it didn't get voted as high as some of our more complex topics like Agile and earned value integration. I personally think requirements is the hardest thing, and so is design. But I think a lot of people are really interested in Agile and earned value integration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like I said, that's something that comes up every single client. It's something that we spend a lot of time working with our clients on, understanding the requirements, regardless of whether they're very agile or not very agile. How does it fit in? So yes, that's good. Thank you, Jessica. All right, so with Agile and earned value in mind, one thing that we really like to tell people who are, especially who are very, have very strong traditional or earned value management backgrounds, like the PMO, is don't break the 3-5-3. So if you're not familiar with the 3-5-3, what I'm talking about is in Scrum, you have 3 roles, 5 events, and 3 artifacts, which I have shown here on the screen. So we're talking about your product owner, Scrum Master, and the team, the 5 events that the Scrum team typically goes through during those iterative cycles, and then the artifacts, which is really just your sprint backlog, product backlog, and of course your working product. So we encourage you to not break the 3-5-3. In other words, just because we have earned value management requirement doesn't mean that we should interfere with the way that the teams are working. And on the top, I'm showing all of the different values and Agile principles that we don't want to interrupt. So we still want to keep these, things like our highest priority really is to satisfy the customer. We welcome changing requirements. These are things that Agilists really value. And just because we have an earned value management requirement, we wouldn't want to interrupt or, not allow those things to still be most important. Okay. Yes, and use earned value to harness Agile data. That's absolutely true. So we have a lot of content that we can share with you about how to do that and what does that mean. So if you are an Agile company or you're working on a contract that's using Agile development approaches, there's a wealth of data that comes out of that. It's actually, you have a lot more visibility, but sometimes earned value professionals might not understand what to do with all of that data or how to get it without interrupting the 353 or without disrupting the Agile principles and values. So we talk about that quite a bit later. We know that you can get a lot of earned value management, actually more data if your teams are using Agile, but just don't interrupt them or disrupt, I should say. Okay, so Agile and EV mapping. So again, you can call it what you want. We said EPIC was one terminology or a term that you could use to identify this large group of scope. And if you look at the NDIA guide or talk to many of the contractors out there, then typically the EPIC does relate to the control account. Again, you could call it something different, but it's important that you identify what piece of scope on the Agile side maps to control accounts, and you should keep in mind the time frame. So typically the epics or control account would span a release. It's something that is maybe taking months and months to complete. It's a larger piece of work that takes some time and can span that release. Whereas the feature is a subset or lower level chunk of work, if you will, that can easily map to work packages and future planning packages, and that should happen within a release. So for example, if your organization has decided that a release is 3 months and you're planning out the next release, then all of the features should be planned to complete within that release, whereas your epics could span multiple releases. And then stories are, much lower level. They're completed within a sprint, and they're typically related to quantifiable backup data or QBD. So it's the lower level details that are held offline in your Agile tool that make up the features that are satisfying the requirements of those features in epics. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And I don't know if we have questions, Jess, but.
I've received a lot of private message questions, and I've been answering them and pointing them to articles wherever possible.
Great. Awesome.
I did go ahead and put a link in the chat. I encourage you guys to take a look at it after this session. It is to our LinkedIn article that we just posted. Denise and I are part of the NDIA Agile Working Group, and we just wrote a paper for them about Agile and software and hardware. And I talk a lot about setting yourself up for success in the way that you create epics and pieces of work. So there's a lot of discussion in there. And also, I've said to a few people, if you find something that you really want to dig into in like a one-on-one session with Denise and I, would be happy to, spend 15, 30 minutes with you answering your targeted questions. So I will send you my email and Denise's email in the chat, so feel free to save that.
Great.
So far, nothing that needs to be publicly addressed, I guess.
Okay, I love it.
Keep rolling.
Okay, great. So this kind of puts it all together. So if you've read any of the documentation that's out there, or you've tried to think about Agile and EV, I think this slide, like I said, really brings it together because you've got all of the earned value things at the top, and on the bottom, you can see that we have Agile listed there. So I'll walk through this for just a couple of minutes. If you look across the top, there is a timeline, really. So I have just a couple of releases up here, release N+1, so it could be however many you have across the life cycle of your product or project. And then you can see that the milestones and accomplishments that you might have received on your integrated master plan, or you've decided for yourself, there's specific technical accomplishments or milestones that you have, those would be laid across the top. They'd be laid across the top in the form of your product roadmap and possibly your integrated master plan as well. And they should be congruent. Your product roadmap should support your integrated master plan. Then if you're thinking about earned value, then you would look at control account, which might be related to your epic or capability, depending on what you've decided for your naming convention. So again, the epics would span across the releases and would be broken down into a subset of features. So you'll notice that, as I mentioned on the last couple of slides, the features would be planned to complete within one release, and that they would be related to your work packages. Or if it's a future release, you might just have planning packages. Then we typically detail plan out this effort in something that's called rolling wave planning. So it's really an earned value term, but I think both earned value and Agile can use this type of planning where it's an iterative planning. I'm detailing out all of the features in an upcoming release, but I'm not detail planning everything for future releases. And as you approach the end of one release, you start to plan the next release. And then down in the Agile space, you can see that we've got the sprints happening here, and that's where the user stories are documented in the Agile tool. So there's several levels of planning, and the Agile sprints, or the user stories that are planned in each of the sprints, support the completion of the features, which support the completion of the epics. So it all rolls up. And this Agile piece, the QBDs or user stories, are kept offline. They're not in the schedule. They're not something that necessarily the earned value people are digging into or planning in great detail. They belong to the Agile teams, but they are the QBDs that roll up to the features. All right. We've got Brooke Troop on the line here with Empower, and we wanted to share this interesting slide with you because they are integrating Agile and EVM. So Brooke, you're more than welcome to unmute if you'd like, otherwise I can explain it here. Okay, so I'm not sure if she's still on the line or not, but basically Empower is a great tool. Many organizations within the Department of Defense use this tool to look at their earned value management data. And if, for example, I'm a control account manager or an analyst, and I notice that I have a control account or a specific scope of work, I'm developing some type of code, and I see that there is a problem, that there's a schedule or a cost problem that I want to dig into, then through this tool, you can link to your Agile tools where you're able to dig in a little bit more and easily translate between what's happening at the higher level at your control account or work package area and what's going on, at a lower level with the details of the stories that, you're working on for that particular effort. So if you want more information, I think Brooke would be happy to. Oh, it says it won't let me unmute. Sorry, Brooke. Let's see if we can do it. Brooke. Try it now, Brooke. Can you hear us? It says self-muted.
Right. It says we've unlocked it on our side, but it doesn't appear like yours is unmuting.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Oh, okay.
Oh, great. Sorry about that. Well, Denise, you explained that perfectly. And yeah, you can visit Encore Analytics website to find out more. But basically, you can link up any sort of Agile tool within Empower and be able to view that information in real time as you're clicking around through your WBS elements. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
And I've chatted everybody the link to that website if you'd like to check that out.
Awesome. Anything to make it easier. So we're definitely looking for ways to understand the data, look at the data, and drill down into the data and make sure that at that reporting level, you can have the insight that you need from the Agile team. So great. Thank you. All right, so one of the things that we talk about with our clients is the staffing plan. So of course, in earned value management, you have to have a responsibility assignment matrix or a RAM, and you have to be able to demonstrate that it's actually executable. You have the appropriate staff in place, and the same is true with Agile development. So you've got your RAM, which is really just the integration of your OBS or who's doing the work and the scope. You've identified your control accounts, but what could be different is that you actually have cross-functional delivery teams or Agile teams executing the work. So in one of our other modules, we talk a lot about how to come up with a staffing plan for your Agile teams. So I won't dive into that too much right now, but I will say regardless if you're using Agile teams or a more traditional approach, you have to have a credible staffing plan. And what we're seeing is that actually on the OBS or in the plans that are being presented to the government, a lot of contractors are presenting cross-functional delivery teams, and they're talking about how those teams will accomplish the work and how they know and can prove that they have a credible staffing plan to accomplish the scope. All right, so here's an example of what a dollarized RAM might look like with the Agile teams. You can see that I just have the Scrum teams here, Scrum team A, B, C, and D. There could be Kanban teams or other types of Agile teams. And what we're looking for is that the control account manager who is responsible for the scope, schedule, and budget has a good, credible plan for executing the work, whether that's a functional organization, an IPT, or Agile teams like this example, and that the teams know what the scope is, what the budget is, and it's traceable to who's executing the work. So control account managers, I've mentioned it a couple times. It's not usually something that if you're just coming from the commercial world and you're, a very agile company, you've got Scrum teams and Kanban teams, or you're using DevSecOps, control account manager might not be a familiar term, but for those of you who are on contracts with earned value management requirements, of course, you're familiar with the control account manager because that's a central person who does have to manage the scope, schedule, and budget. So who should be the CAM and what is their role if you have an, agile teams executing the work? So what we like to say is that control account managers really have to interface with the product owner and the scrum master, and it might not be just one team. They're especially on these very large projects that most of us have worked on in the government sector. One control account manager might have several agile teams that they're interfacing with and that are executing their work. So it should be perhaps somebody at a higher level that can interface with those product owners, scrum masters across the teams. So what would they do with the agile teams? Well, what we typically see is that the control account manager is attending some of the scrum events as needed. This picture that we have here is, it's actually a demo. It's a system level demo that the control account manager is attending. So they're seeing what the output of the scrum team is at the end of either an iteration or at a release. So who is best suited for the CAM role? That definitely depends. A lot of times, especially when organizations are just starting to move towards agility, they say, oh, well, can the CAM also be the product owner, or should the CAM be the scrum master? Can they wear dual hats? So, it's great if you can have a CAM who is not in another role as well. But we have seen control account managers who are also product owners or at some scaled level of product ownership. Okay, so work authorization. This comes up as a bit of a tricky thing with earned value and agile. Sometimes organizations ask us about the freeze period, or how can we handle, work authorization if everything isn't planned out in agile. Really, what I'd like to say is that work still has to be authorized before the teams start. So if you're using some of this rolling wave planning and release planning that we briefly mentioned earlier, it really isn't an issue. So you still have to have a control account work authorization, or some people call it a work authorization document. The control account manager is still responsible for a very specific scope of work. They have a budget, they have a schedule at that higher level. And they're working with the teams to understand what is the upcoming work that's going to be executed. And the main thing to remember here is that the agile teams can't start working unless it's authorized in the form of a work authorization document. But that's something that the control account manager should have. It's not like I'm talking to the scrum master or development team about the control account work authorization. It's something that's handled, through your EV department, your PMO, your control account manager has the typical work authorization document, and they're working with the product owners to make sure that the work is authorized before it's something that's in the product backlog that the team is about to start working on. So we don't want to have anybody working on unauthorized work is really the main issue here. All right, so we've got an example, just a high-level example of what an integrated master schedule might look like if you are developing work using an agile development approach. So a couple of main things that I want to tell you about the integrated master schedule is that if you're used to a very detailed integrated master schedule and you're using a more traditional approach, and you compare that to an agile IMS, what you'll notice is that the IMS using agile only goes down to a feature level, for example. So you'll have your epics, which are your control accounts, you'll have your features, which are your work packages, and that's where your critical path is. So a lot of times when I'm talking to people who aren't familiar with Agile and they see a schedule that looks like this, it's a little concerning perhaps to them because there's not a lot of detail in the schedule. So some points to remember is that you still have to have a valid critical path. The features have to be identified and logically linked so that you can identify what is the critical path, what are the driving paths, and also the quantifiable backup data that supports this has to be in the Agile tool, and it has to support the integrated master schedule. So we can dive into that more. We have lots of slides about schedule and can answer questions if you have anything specific. I think those are the highlights. It's usually the Agile pieces only go down to the work package level because the stories are offline in the QBDs in the Agile tool. And also to note that usually not the entire project on these large government contracts anyways are executed using Agile. So there might be other parts of the integrated master schedule that are more traditional, and the parts that are Agile look more like this, where it's talking about capabilities and epics and features, and where you've got something in the Agile tool to back it up. So still have a valid critical path, and the backup is in the tool. All right, so developing the master project schedule, we've talked a lot about road mapping and release plans. I showed you an example of the integrated master plan, which related to the Agile Teams product roadmap. And this is really just another view. It's saying, listen, if you've got your integrated master schedule and whatever scheduling tool like MS Project or Primavera P6, and it has to relate to and support the Agile release plan. So it's just another example of having that vertical traceability and making sure that the work that your teams are doing in your Agile environment support the overall milestones and support your Agile release plan. And you can have a timeline like this in MS Project or some other type of high-level master project schedule, and they just all relate, and it ensures that the work that the teams are doing in the Agile tools support the overall high-level objectives from the earned value management side. Okay, we have a lot of different types of schedule assessment tools. Empower, I believe, has one. This is an example of SteelRay Project Analyzer. And the point of the tool is that, or the point of the slide, I should say, is that the DCMA, as many of you know, is moving much more towards data-driven compliance with earned value management, and they're taking the tool, especially with the latest IPM DAR or reporting that you're giving to the DCMA, you're giving them your entire schedule file, and they're looking at it. The PASIG, the Planning and Scheduling Excellence Guide, has been updated to discuss some of these Agile approaches that we're talking about, like the critical path at the feature level, and you can still be compliant with Agile. So we have a lot of defense contractors that have earned value management requirements and are executing very nicely using these Agile approaches. And when we run their schedules through analyzers such as SteelRay, then they're still meeting the complexities and the requirements that they need to have in place to be compliant with earned value management requirement. So the IPM DAR is out now, just a little while ago, and you can still be compliant if you're Agile, so that's good. All right, Jess, that's it for that particular topic.
This section, so the next highest voted one, and almost exactly the same one, is Agile and EVMS Performance Measurement, but I did see a question come through just a second.
Sure.
So just to make sure we don't move on without answering it. Roberta Martin says, with the lack of detail, how does one manage and establish priorities when the project starts to go off track if the details are not present? So one of the things I'd like to say is that even from the very beginning, you have an overall high-level plan. All of the scope is present, and you've captured that in the form of these larger groups of work. Like in our case, we're calling them epics at the highest level. But you might even have an even higher level, like themes or capabilities or modules, or sometimes people have a need for more granularity on these larger projects. So when you do that, you're going to have that infrastructure in place in the form of your preliminary requirements that we discussed earlier. You're going to have definition of done and acceptance criteria that describe what it means to be done and the quality that you're expecting when you're done. And then managing the priorities of that, there's like a number, anywhere from, I don't know, a dozen to an endless amount of prioritization techniques that product owners use to try to make sure that they're getting the work that needs to be done in each release, organized so that it can be done effectively and by that need by date that's in the IMP or in their milestones. So when the project starts or when this project starts to go off track, there's usually enough detail there, at least for you to understand in general, what are the problems you're trying to solve and within what parameters are you operating, what environments, so that it's not like you're just going in and starting working with a customer and developing a product without defining what that solution should look like. So in my opinion, when the project starts to go off track, you generally have more visibility than you would if you were using a traditional approach on exactly where it's going off track. And that empowers you to make earlier decisions for how you can get it back on track. Did that help answer your question? Roberta? Yes, okay.
Oh, good. Yeah, I would say one of the biggest benefits of being agile is the prioritization, the visibility into the prioritization. You have so much more visibility. Yeah.
And we have some slides on here that basically just say change is inevitable. Like everything is always will go wrong. There will be things that go wrong in your program and it just isn't going to go to track. And the advantage of being agile and creating an architecture that can adapt to change late in the development cycle is that when you encounter that change, it's not going to cripple you and make it so that you're doing, a systematic overhaul. You're just overhauling these subsets or these smaller pieces. That's the goal. Thanks, Emily. Emily says agreed. Yay! I like it.
That's good.
Oh, look,
Right.
there it is. Change is inevitable. Okay,
Yeah.
Denise, it's the Agile and Earned Value Management Performance Measurement slide.
All right, give me just a second here to find that next section.
So we often joke because we used to be traditional program managers about how it does at times feel like it's reactive. You may have insight into variances, but I will say that the one thing Denise and I can just agree on wholeheartedly is that you'll have heightened visibility, more visibility than you've ever had before. And now it's just a question of, now that you have the visibility, are you making the right use of it? Do you have the right metrics into play to know what to pull on, which levers to pull on? All right, guys, we're starting the next topic. This one only had one less vote than the first one.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, like it was
Jessica was looking at the poll, so I didn't know.
It's super close.
Great. Okay, so this slide is actually taken from the NGI guide. Again, Jessica chatted you the link to that. It's an excellent guide that, really is the latest, most up-to-date information about how to tackle Agile and EV. So I'll walk you through this slide. We pulled these because they really just do a great job of explaining how to take earned value if you're using this approach. So it's similar to another slide I showed you before where I have the timeline across the top. I have, since we're looking at a pretty high level here, you can imagine this release 1 is 3 months and then another 3 months. So we're looking at several months of work here. And you can see that epics span that time. They span the releases. So it might take me 3 releases to complete this particular epic. And so because it's such a huge chunk of work, the Agile teams have broken down the scope in this particular epic or the capability, and they've made several different features. So for example, we'll say that there's 4 features in this particular epic. The teams are working on these features, and by the end of release 1, they've completed this feature. Since this feature X.1 is done, then that rolls up to be 18% of this particular epic. So at the end of release 1, epic 1 is 18% complete, or epic X is 18% complete. Similarly, if they're working on a couple of different features, because there's usually many features going on if you have a lot of Agile teams. So the Scrum teams or Agile teams are working on feature X.2 and X.3. They've completed feature X.2 and X.3, so by the end of this next release, that rolls up to be 46% complete for that particular release. And you can look at the cumulative percent complete, which would be 64% of that epic. Until they've completed feature 4 at the end of release 3, and now that shows that the epic is now complete. I realize that it's not always 100%, so I will talk about what happens if it's not a perfect world and they didn't complete the epics, but let's say things go as planned. It's pretty easy to see how completing features, rolls up and allows you to identify the percent complete at that epic level. So I'm going to take it down to the next level. Again, this comes directly from the NDIA guide. Earn value measured at the feature level. So now I've changed the timeline. I've changed from that release level or macro level of 3 months down to sprints. So we'll say that this organization has decided that the best sprint time box is 2 weeks. So we'll say it's 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, and they're working on just one feature. Hopefully they're just working on one feature. So if I'm looking at the stories that the teams are completing, of course there would be more than just one story, but it's just a small example here. If they complete this story, which is 5 points, then they're at the end of sprint 1. If they've completed their stories, that rolls up and they've completed 31% of the feature. So very similar to the last slide, just at that next level down. And in sprint 2, we're looking at completing story B and story C, and if that happened, those stories are complete as planned, then the feature would be 50% complete, and so on. So I'm going to keep digging a little bit here for you. Hopefully I can explain it well. So to update the IMS, obviously if the teams are completing stories, and that's great, but what happens when it's time for that monthly integrated master schedule update, and you need to know what % complete are you, and you have to be able to report that to your customer. So if we pretend that the features on the last slide, the first one was Vader feature A. It's spanned across a couple of sprints. The teams are working on it, and we know that it's 44 story points. So we've got all these different stories underneath. You can imagine there are more stories that are in the Agile Teams or the Agile tool in the backlog. And the Agile teams are working on sprint 1. You can see here that they have completed the permission assignment and maintenance story, but they didn't complete the sensitive data restriction story. So the sprint ends, it's just a time box. The team has to move on. So at the end of sprint 1, that feature is only 11% complete because they completed only the 5 story points for the permission assignment and maintenance. They didn't complete this one, and so they do not get those 13 points. It's kind of like 0 or 100. Either you finished the story or you didn't finish the story. Even if you started working on it but didn't complete it. In this case, they just get the 5 points. So we would do the math here, which is pretty simple. They completed 5 out of the 44 story points for that feature, which tells me that they are 11% complete. So if we move on to sprint 2, it looks like this Scrum team or these teams are struggling because they're not getting all of their planned work done. In this example, they completed the step deviation story as well as the limit data for unauthorized users story, but they didn't get to the controlled damage to system story. So what happens here? Well, very similar. We're only counting the stories that they actually completed, and that 5 points is not complete. It goes back into the backlog for future prioritization by the product owner. And at this point, they've completed 26 stories. If you add up, hopefully I did the math right there. I think I did. So that's 26 out of the 44 stories would equal 59% complete. So at this point, if I'm looking at Vader feature A and I'm updating my integrated master schedule, then I know that I'm behind schedule. If I'm the control account manager, I need to go talk to these product owners, or hopefully I'm already talking to the product owners and I'm aware of what's going on within the Scrum team and why they're behind schedule, what happened with the sensitive data restriction and control damage to the system. So I'm able to dig down a little bit more through use of the Agile tools, also by attending the Scrum team events if it's Scrum, and understanding what's going on there. But I'm definitely reporting that we're behind schedule because instead of completing the Vader feature A by this monthly update, we're only 59% complete. Okay. Oh, and there's future stories out there. I'll continue the story and answer questions if you have it. But that's how you would get % complete for a feature by using the Agile team stories as quantifiable backup data. Okay, so same set of features, same set of stories that we looked at before. So you know that some of the stories were not complete. So what happens to those stories if they're not complete? It's still work that the team has to do. It's planned work. We know we're behind schedule. So what typically happens is as the teams close the sprint in JIRA or whatever the Agile tool is, those stories go to the backlog. And it's up to the product owner to prioritize that work. In this case, the product owner is saying, the most important work is still to complete the sensitive data restriction and the limit data for unauthorized users. So the product owner is prioritizing those two 13-point stories in the next sprint. That person, he or she, is saying that's still the most important work that's going to be able to deliver the most value to the customer. So I'm going to prioritize that, and I'm going to look at what is the remaining work. The control account manager still has the responsibility of updating their ETC. So they're looking at the remaining work of the sensitive data restriction and limit data along with the other work that's left. And they're forecasting that work to be complete in the next sprint. So that doesn't really change. It doesn't change from a control account manager perspective. They're still looking at the work that was completed, looking at what's left to do, and they're updating their forecast. And then in the Agile tools, those stories are moving to the backlog and then getting prioritized. And in this case, they've been pulled into the sprint backlog for sprint 3, and the teams will continue to execute that work.
Denise, you have a question from Emily. We are showing these types of metrics to our customers currently. Do you have any advice on making these updates or story point-based reports more visual? My customers are used to seeing baseline projection reports, and I currently cannot get them that with our Agile processes.
Okay, yes, we have a whole section on metrics that we can talk to you about, and yes, we are used to using JIRA as well as some other Agile tools, but we also typically layer on additional add-ons like EZBI, and we have a whole host of different ways to show this data. You can also export anything and everything from JIRA if you wanted to do some type of manual thing in Excel to, I'm not sure that that's the best way to do it. But yes, we can show you, I don't think I have a slide right here that shows that, but yes, it's possible to demonstrate how you're doing from, like, you can look at the feature, you can look at the epic, you can show that you're off track, and especially from a time perspective or schedule perspective, it's really easy to see when you're behind schedule and not projecting to complete. And a lot of times we actually give our contractors, or our contractors give the customer access to the tools where they can look at real-time data. If they have a close and collaborative, relationship with the customer, that's something that you could just see in the Agile tools visually instead of just on a report.
Cool.
Variance analysis, and also if that person wants to chat us later, maybe we can help them a little more specifically offline. So, all right. So variance analysis, maybe this is the kind of metrics that you were talking about before. So how can Agile team data support variance analysis? So in the case where, like I said, we didn't complete some of the stories, the teams are not on track, and it's easy to see from your typical earned value management type of graph that we're behind schedule. But how can we support that from the Agile teams? So this is the same data that I was showing you before. It's for that first feature. So it's the 44 story points that we had planned. The team is behind schedule. They only completed 26, or teams are behind schedule. So we know that it's only 59% complete. And this is, like you said, where we're going, how are we going to drill down into what's going on in the Agile teams? So this is where we would want to look at some of the things like the burn down charts and maybe additional data that we have if we're using a more complex tool like EZBI, so that the control account manager can drill down and really understand what is the root cause and what is the corrective action. Are we going to work on those stories, next sprint, or are there bugs that we're having trouble fixing? Is there something else, some other test that's failing or whatever? So, yeah.
So Philip has a great question. When you pull sensitive data restriction work out of sprint 1, does that retroactively make the work accomplished in sprint 1 100%? Example, 5 out of 5 rather than 5 out of 18? And I would say the answer is actually no, it wouldn't. And the reason is because tools like your Agile tools, JIRA, or even a board that you're using, when you finish that sprint, it's done. And what you finished is either done or not done. And just because actually what's really happening there is if you don't finish anything, it's going right to your product backlog. And so it's up to the product owner to reprioritize that work. In this case, the product owner reprioritized it and said, this is really important. We need to get it done in the next sprint. So they put it at the top of their backlog. That doesn't always happen. And when you don't finish something and it drops out, it's still counted in the total of what wasn't finished. So the answer is no, and that's how the Agile tools are set up to calculate as well. So if you pull something out of a sprint or you close the sprint and you didn't finish it, it will go back to the backlog and it has to be reprioritized. Does that help answer the question? Philip?
This 44 doesn't change. So even if the total that you have planned for the Vader feature doesn't change. So just because you don't complete it, it's not like this, just because that's moving to another sprint, it doesn't mean that it's not still tied to that feature.
Right. And so Erica's question is, you put dollars and hours against the feature, which you didn't complete. So you spent money and hours on something that cannot be released. Very true.
Exactly. Yes. Yep. All good points. I love it. Okay, so I'll just keep going with the example for another slide or two. So this is just another view really of the same thing. So again, the feature still remains 44 points. So that's how much the team estimated that work. That hasn't changed. We just didn't complete all of it. So the feature we were working on is, as the warfighter, I need a high level of encryption so that I can mitigate security risks and communication vulnerabilities. That's still the scope. That hasn't changed. These are the 5 stories that we were working on. And again, just some of them were completed and some of them weren't. And the partially completed stories, like even if we were starting to work on this 13-pointer, even if we did some of it and just didn't quite get it done by the end of the sprint, we're still taking 0%. So I wanted to make sure for this story, we're saying it's not done. It's either done or not done, and not partially complete if you're using this approach with stories as QBDs.
So Pavi said, would that be a cost variance?
If you, well, it's
perfect timing because you clicked the button. So stories not completed, they can contribute to that. Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. If you're working and it's taking hours and hours and hours, much longer than you planned, and the teams are charging to this particular story, which is part of your feature, then absolutely it can be a cost variance, and you can see that as well. All right, this is the next one I always get. Most people ask me, especially when we're talking about using the backlog and when things don't complete, what if the team is adding stories, or what if the teams are changing stories? What does happen? If the team adds stories, then I typically ask the team, did these new stories change the acceptance criteria of your feature? So again, Jessica had mentioned previously that the acceptance criteria is closely tied to the requirements. You can call it acceptance criteria. Basically, did it change the scope of the feature or not? And if the answer is, yes, it changed the scope of the feature, or it changed the acceptance criteria, then I might have a situation where I need to do potentially a baseline change. If it didn't, then it's a forecast change. It's just going to take you longer. It's just you're running into more bugs, or you forgot that you needed to do an additional test or something like that. So if yes, it could be a baseline change, but if no, if it's the feature remains the same and the teams are just adding or changing stories, then it probably is a performance issue. Of course, if I was the CAM, I would be talking to that product owner and I'd be looking at the backlog and understanding what's going on so that I can make this type of assessment, because the backlog is fluid. It does change quite often. And in fact, it's like a living document. And that's something that, when I first started understanding Agile, I didn't understand how that would really work with earned value management, because earned value is a little more rigorous, and we're concerned about all these changes. But one of the things that I would even say is, like, the beauty of Agile is that the teams do have a little bit more flexibility, and that allows them to become more innovative and more creative about how they do the work. But it does mean that sometimes the backlog changes based on customer feedback, based on testing, based on the way the teams are going to do the work. But this is a quick and easy sanity check on whether or not it should be be a baseline change, or really it's just a forecast or performance issue. Okay. All right. So we can do all kinds of different modules. We can do a lot of different training. We're going to keep going with this webinar, but we wanted to take the opportunity to let you know that if you want to know more about Agile and EV integration or other topics with just Agile in general, Agile and EV, we offer a lot of different customized workshops. So we'd love to help you.
Awesome.
All right.
Okay, so the next topic is actually funny because it's Introduction to Agile.
Okay.
So now that we talked about really complicated things, we're going to jump back to the basics, which is an introduction to Agile. So we have an introduction to Agile, an introduction to Scrum, an introduction to Kanban. And actually, if any of you are interested or have team members that need to get some more advanced training in like Scrum Mastery or product ownership, Denise and I are offering a couple of workshops over the next month or so to help get your team's license, and we do that remotely.
Cool. So I made you the presenter. I know you love to do this one, so
I do.
If that works. I'd love to hear what you guys think about this approach to the webinar. We were just kind of tired of picking the topics for you, and we really wanted to get feedback from you on which topics you're most interested in. So if anybody wants to chat or message us just about using this poll approach and letting you choose which sections to learn about, I'd love to hear that feedback. Some people love it. Let's see.
Agile Lean Coffee.
Coffee, yeah, it's like that. I like the poll approach, but still interested in the others. Yeah, so this is actually a series. So we're doing today, and then the next 2 Fridays, we're going to continue. So we're going to keep the same topics, but cross them out. Like the ones that we've already done today, we won't add to the poll. So next week, you can pick a different topic, and we'll keep going. Cool. Jess, are you able to present?
There. I'm almost there. I actually was just going to have you share, but that's okay.
Okay. Either way is good. Cool.
So,
yeah,
am I sharing yet?
I'm not sure. So, okay, lots and lots of comments on that. That's awesome. Yeah, Jess, I can see your slides now. So very insightful. Someone said, I like the idea, but people need to understand Agile before approaching Agile EV. Yeah, that's the only risk, is that normally if we're teaching like a day-long class or a couple days, at your site, of course, we would go through the basics first and then the more complex topics. So yeah, that's a risk. But a lot of people like it. And some people didn't get to do the poll. One person said, was the poll given at the beginning? Yes.
Yeah,
so if you were late to the webinar, then you missed the poll. So that might be a little confusing. So we gave a series of different topics, and everybody voted on which one they wanted. And we're going based on, majority rules, basically. So. All right, Jess, I can see your slides.
Okay, good. I'm ready. Okay, so if you don't know what the Agile Manifesto is, it's basically 4 values that 17 software developers came together. This was back in 2001 in Snowbird, Utah, and they were just basically frustrated. They were frustrated with the pace of software development. They were frustrated with the cultural obstacles that they were running into, and they were coming together to discuss what was going well, what was not going well, and what they could agree on what Agile really even means. And so you'll see this list of names at the bottom. That's the 17 software developers. These are the things they said were important to them and they could agree on. And that was that having individuals interacting is more valuable than having a bunch of processes and tools and communicating and organizing through that forum. Working software, having something, we even say working solutions now because it's not just software, but having something that you can demonstrate to a customer and solicit real-time feedback is more valuable than giving them a stack of paper and saying, here you go, tell me what you think. Collaborating with your customer and really building that relationship of direct communication is better than just sending somebody a document and saying, sign here. And then responding to change. So developing an architecture that's flexible and being able to say, okay, yes, we can pivot if you need to pivot late in a development cycle, over following a subscriptive plan. And so these 4 values that we talk about, it's not that the things on the right aren't valuable, because as you know, many of you are on these large contracts. We can't succeed without those things. We can't succeed without documentation tools, contract negotiation. But when we have a preference for the things on the left, we're really getting a higher communication saturation than we are when we do the things on the right. So I'm going to really quickly go through the 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto, and I think we'll have enough time for the last topic, which is responding to the request for proposals. So the number one highest thing there is to do is to satisfy the customer. And I really look at these 12 principles as something that I can follow in my personal life and also something that I can do in my professional life. So satisfying the customer is the most important thing I can do. And the way that I do it is by giving early, continuous delivery of working product that's valuable to them. That's how I make a good relationship between me and my customers. And that nothing is as important as getting the customer exactly what they want and they need. The other thing is that I need to understand change is good and change is going to happen, and it's going to happen late in my project. And Denise and I have never ever seen a contract or program be executed perfectly well and everything went to plan. And if you have, please private message me. I want to know who you are. So business is changing, and that's the truth. Requirements are going to change. The way we understand our requirements are going to change. New technological developments are going to happen. We're going to have access to different things we didn't have access to at the beginning of our program, especially some of these that stretch 5-10 years. So what we need to do is get better at architecting our product so that it's more modular and it can change without making a huge systematic impact. So that's the second one. You see my pace, I'm just cooking. In case some of you are just doing a refresh, that's what I'm doing here. And the third thing is it's always better to get something physically working. This one kind of makes me laugh because I've had times where my Scrum teams think we know what our customer wants, and then we show them something and it's just not even close to what they had in mind. And so when you give them that type of insight, you really do end up making them happier and getting those feedback to them in a faster time. And one of the other things we noticed was if you use Microsoft Excel, it has all of that functionality, but very few people ever actually use all the features and functionality of Excel. And so we really believe that 80% of the value is really in 20% of the work. And that's why there's an emphasis on creating something that's working so you can get that feedback and make sure that what you're making is relevant and needed by your customer. We also believe that it's important that as you iterate, that you're doing this and integrating at a system level, because then you have something that's demonstratable and valuable to that customer. So that's why we focus on things like the minimum viable product that I'll talk about a little bit more. So that was 3 of the 12 principles. We're moving. Okay, so number 4. We want to get the people who are selling and interfacing with the customer, and on that business side, interfacing with people who are actually developing the product. And part of that's because this alleviates waste. Waste is when people are sitting around trying to figure out how to do something or what to do. We want to get rid of waste, and we want to be able to absorb the full understanding of why we're doing something. And the best way to do that is to have the people who do understand that share their understanding with people who are actually developing the product. And it gets everyone on the same page, so you're not just throwing things over the fences. So we want to break down barriers, improve our process, focus our efforts on avoiding waste or misunderstandings. The other thing we want to do is build projects around people who are motivated. So how do you motivate people? That's a big thing right now. We're all remote. We're all trying to, organize our teams and keep going despite the fact that we're all going through computer screens now. So we want to motivate and self-organize our teams. And the best way to do that is by empowering and trusting our team that if I tell you all the parameters around the problem I need you to solve, that you can go forward and creatively solve that problem as long as you meet the requirements that I've given you. So projects with empowered people who are excited and get to work in these little cross-functional, hyper-performing teams, they like to show up to work because work is fun. And so they're going to work harder on your projects, which is going to result in you having creative, automated processes that make your project delivered earlier. So that's the whole goal. When people are motivated, they find more clever ways to do work. Face-to-face, just like Denise and I are putting our smiling faces on this webinar, seeing our face gives you a whole bunch of opportunity to avoid miscommunication. You can read into my facial expression to understand what I'm trying to say. And it removes the time that you're going to sit there and wait for an answer to your question. I love this graphic on the left-hand side. It talks about how the ways you communicate can either be really rich and productive, or they can be really static and not very valuable. And the best way that we can do our conversation to date, now that we have the coronavirus, is a face-to-face video conversation where you're, chatting questions or coming up with a conversation, or even giving me feedback on what you like or don't like, raising your hand, etc. Okay, so we talked about a working product. A working product is something that's been tested. And that doesn't mean you have an entire, system that meets your customer requirements. It means that at the end of every sprint, I have something that is developed, tested, and demonstrated, and now I can get feedback on it. So it's some subset of that overall product. Humphrey's Law wasn't made by Humphreys and Associates, but it's basically that users don't know what they want until they actually see that working product. And we live by that. Like Denise and I live by that at Radically Better Agile. We want to make sure our customers can see the product so they can give us feedback on that. Less like a sprint. I like this. The pace of the development should be sustainable. So your goal with getting this group of people in a cross-functional, close-knit team is not to work them like workhorses. The goal is to actually make it so that they come up with more ways to automate, to make their process more efficient, so that they can keep a sustainable pace, a 40-hour work week, and so that they can produce more, their outcome increases. So think of it less like a sprint, like, oh my goodness, we need to get as much done as we possibly can from the resources that we have, and more like a marathon. We want to have a consistent, repeatable process for these contracts so that it's something that we can correctly estimate and predict. Quality design. So if you do things well, Agile, sometimes people think Agile means quick, and quick means do things sloppy. That's not the goal. The goal is to come up with more ways to automate and make that process more efficient. But the goal is not to cut corners and make that product a low quality product. You want to do good, high quality work. You want to prevent errors. And some of the ways that we do that is by incorporating things like the definition of done. Definition of done is basically a checklist. And so when you do a kind of like software development, a definition of done for us might be every time we develop code, we need to make sure it's peer reviewed. That's an example of a definition of done. You're keeping that quality standard as part of your process. Number 10, keep it simple. This is my favorite, keep it simple. So you want to spend most of your time with that 20%. Remember I said 80-20 rule? 80% of your value is found in 20% of your work. So by prioritizing that, you're going to get the most value from the time that your team is putting in, and you're going to have a minimum viable product that's potentially releasable out into the public, to your client. So a minimum viable product is a version of the product with just enough features that you can ship to them and they can provide feedback for future development. So think of like a field trial or something that they can do with one of your early releases. Self-organizing teams. So teams get to decide how they do work. That's a huge difference between traditional approaches and an agile approach. So a team has the autonomy to choose how they're going to build the product. It's the what that's been completely concreted for them. So the what are the things like the requirements, the parameters, the acceptance criteria, so that they know what's the environment I'm developing this product in. Okay, and then number 12, you have to reflect on the good and the bad if you want to truly be agile. And so that's built into a lot of the processes that we can talk about, like the approaches, like Scrum, Kanban. You want to reflect on what's going good, what's going bad, and how can I get better? That's the constant question. How can we get better at this? What can we improve? And so that's the 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto. And I know I went through it kind of fast, but if this was a refresher, good. I hope you now have, a quick, okay, that's what Agile is, I remember. But I'm open to any questions, so please chat them. And Denise, you can maybe tell me if you have
Yes, I'm looking, so far so good.
Okay. The other thing is Waterfall Agile development. So I want to talk about this really quickly before we go, because we've talked a little bit about requirements, and I want to talk about how that fits in. So in a waterfall approach, we spend time in a sequential manner where we define our requirements, design our product, develop the product, integrate the pieces together so it's a system, test that system, and then we deploy it or ship it. So that's a typical waterfall approach. And then an agile approach is actually to define just enough requirements for your agile teams to be able to successfully work within those modules. And they break it down into small pieces that they can accomplish within a couple of days to a couple of weeks in that sprint time box. They design that piece of that subset of the product, they build it, they test it, and they show it in their demo or sprint review and say, hey, customer, what do you think about this piece that we developed? They get feedback, which may cause them to change their next release, how they design it, how they build it, test it, release it. And this processing continues until finally you have just enough of a product that it's acceptable to your customer, it meets their needs, and they're happy. And then you ship it. That's when you deliver that product. So that's the difference between Agile. And the benefits, in my opinion, are that you have higher visibility, you lower your risk, because when Denise and I managed large contracts or programs, you get to that integration point where you've gotten things from your subcontractors, you've developed things in-house, you put it all together, you test it at the system level, and there's tons of bugs and fixes, and sometimes you even have to go back to scratch, back to redesign components and parts of your system. So that's been our typical experience. Now, with using Agile, that doesn't mean that it's not like you have a perfect design, everything goes flawlessly. But the thing is you're capturing those bugs earlier in that development cycle, and you're catching it along the way, so that when you get to the end product, it's much less costly. Where in the waterfall model, when you catch it, it's so late in that development cycle, it's farther out. The impact is financially a lot more than on the bottom, in the bottom example. All right, so that was it for Agile and Earned Value. Denise and I offer Agile maturity assessments. If you've never done that and you've ever wanted to know, we spend a lot of money on Agile. Are we actually Agile? Is anything improving? One of the first things that we did is snap a baseline of where we were with Agile, and a maturity assessment is a great way to do that. If you snap the baseline with where you're at, and then every quarter go back and reassess your Agile teams and the way that you're approaching Agile, you'll have a good sense of if your strategies are working and if you're actually becoming more Agile on these contracts. So that's something that we do offer.
Oh, hey Jess, so I did get a question that I think you would love to answer. It's up your down your alley, however you say it. Okay, so it says, I struggle with how Agile, that was originally developed for software development, applies to hardware and mechanical products. The whole idea of sprints of releasable products in 2 to 4 week chunks just does not seem to fit with hardware development. Can you please discuss the difference in Agile applied to hardware development?
Absolutely. And I chatted a link to a paper in the chat box some time ago about the paper that we developed for the NDIA Agile Working Group. And it really tackles that. So the company that I worked for is a company called New York Air Brake in upstate New York, and they are in the rail industry. They develop braking systems for the passenger and the commercial world. And so there's a lot of safety regulations and similarities in the bureaucracy and requirements of working in an environment like that. And we migrated to using an Agile methodology. And in that Agile methodology, we had at first a start in software. I told you I was on one of the first software beta teams. So we started like most companies did. And then quickly our software teams were outpacing the firmware and hardware teams. And we were having problems basically waiting on hardware. So we just started looking at it using Kanban and basically looking at our flow and our value stream of getting our product out the door. And we slowly started iterating on how we could be more agile in our hardware development. So we set up a team for our hardware development, and we tackled things like our suppliers and getting the parts in-house quicker. So we bought 3D printers so the Scrum teams could, maybe they couldn't actually get the real material that we were going to make, our material composition for the physical product, but they could 3D print and they could design something that is at least demonstratable to the customer, and we could test out multiple products. We also hired people that specialized in modeling so that they could model some of the thoughts that we had and we could test things out in that way. So there's actually a number of steps you can take to make it so that you have something meaningful at the end of a 2-week sprint. And I will say that with hardware, things that you're up against that other like software, non-physical things aren't up against is the cost of rapid prototyping, of trying to get something physical in-house, and the lead time. Software doesn't have that type of constraint. So what we did was make the most of the time that we were waiting for our products, and we also streamlined our sourcing process so that we could have some suppliers that were able to get us materials incrementally. So there's a lot of steps that I can advise you on for how you can start to be successful with that. But I actually have products that, if you want to set up a private session with me, I can show you that we developed using Agile, and they were developed within 3 to 4 months, and they used an iterative approach to do that. So it's possible to create working product every 2 weeks with hardware, but my definition of working product may be our cartridge-based angle cock. I like to use that example. It sits in between cars. And what it basically does is you can open it and release air, which will apply brakes, or you can close it and it will allow the brakes to go back on again, or allow the brakes to go off. The point of it is if a car separates from another car, then it's simulating a derailment. So you want to be able to apply brakes. And that concept is something that we were able to tackle and create within a few months, showing 3D printed things and little incremental steps while we waited for the final product. Also, we were able to get like samples of material and start testing it in our labs before we even had a finalized design. So things like that. Did that help? I mean, there's really, I could go into it for so long, but okay, good. It seems like everybody's saying yes, and Kanban is Agile. Yes, yeah. Kanban is Agile. I love it, guys. Yeah, so you'll notice when I was talking about Agile, I never said do Scrum, do Kanban, etc., because you don't need to do any of that. You can be Agile in your personal life or in your professional life just by following those principles. I always recommend to be very cautious about taking on frameworks, and if you do just the minimum that it requires you to do. So I wouldn't recommend you implementing something too big for your organization or starting too far. I would start with yourself and then expand slowly. Cool, so that was a great topic. And then the next one, Denise, I think we have enough time because the RFP slides are only a few and it's more just...
Yeah, that's a small section. We can do that. Let's see. So we've tried out lots of tools, and I have to say this one's a little new. Jess, maybe you can keep presenting. I can't get it to switch back.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the problem I had too.
Yeah, we've tried lots of tools and all the remote training and stuff. So this one is new. We really like it, but we haven't quite figured out all the quirks. So, all right. Yeah, if you want to go to those, awesome. All right. So in my experience, there's a couple of things that can happen. Well, lots of things that can happen when you're a contractor and you're trying to respond to an RFP. So one thing that is pretty typical that Jessica and I have experienced lately is that the contractor gets this RFP. They really want to respond to the RFP. They are a very agile company. They're anticipating that they're going to use some type of agile development approach to execute the scope. But the problem is that the RFP is very waterfall. So they get this request for proposal, and it has very waterfall language, like some of the things I told you earlier, like a very waterfall WBS. They have technical reviews that are laid out in a very waterfall way. And so Jessica and I help them with how to handle that, how to handle responding to a traditional RFP if you're going to be agile. So here are some of the challenges. The work breakdown structure and the statement of work are very waterfall, and that can have a lot of impact on the way that the customer is expecting the architecture of the product to be. They might, and also they might want to see all of the designs for everything up front, whereas in a more agile, environment, that's not really the way that, we're doing work. So that can present some problems. Also, we talked about requirements briefly earlier, and a lot of times the requirements are detailed or are expected to be detailed all up front in this, more traditional type RFP. And then the technical reviews. I showed you a few different types of technical reviews where up at the top of the slide was all of the very waterfall systems engineering technical reviews versus the more agile approach. So a lot of times the companies want to have an agile approach. They want to have, all of the benefits of agility, and they want their customer to be involved. But how do they respond to these really traditional RFPs and still be agile? And also sometimes the customer even puts in that they want the company or the contractor to use agile or be agile, but they don't understand it enough from the customer's perspective. So they say they want the contractor to be agile, but it's still a very waterfall RFP, and the customer just doesn't really understand how that impacts agility. So on the bottom part of the slide, I'm just going to give you a few ideas about ways that you can approach responding to these traditional RFPs. We showed you how to start mapping the product capabilities. So when we showed the mapping of the epics and the features and how that relates to the work breakdown structure and the style paragraphs and the requirements, so you can do some of that upfront mapping and explain to the customer how you're going to use an agile development approach, but how you're still satisfying, the entire statement of work and satisfying the scope. Also, defining the high-level requirements. So this includes the functional as well as the interface requirements. I know Jessica can elaborate a ton on requirements and how, even if you're really agile and don't have any earned value requirements, how you still have to define some high-level requirements and figure out where the interfaces occur, that system-level requirements. So that's something that you can still do. You probably need to do anyway. And then you can talk about how you are relating the requirements to the statement of work. You can introduce the concept of acceptance criteria. So we mentioned that earlier. I think there were some questions in dialogue about what is acceptance criteria. But I don't know if we elaborated enough to say that through all levels of Agile, we use acceptance criteria. So we take that vision and we take that initial product architecture and the backlog and roadmap, that first few steps that we do where we're identifying what are the epics and what are the features. We have really good acceptance criteria there. So that has it relates the work that we're doing to the requirements of statement of work. We also do that as we break down the work into stories. So sometimes if you have that dialogue, or if you're responding to an RFP, if you incorporate how you're approaching requirements and how you're going to use this concept of acceptance criteria, that helps the customer feel much better about your approach. Also, you can outline the plan for incremental reviews. So you can say, I see, basically I see in the RFP that you want very traditional technical reviews. We also think technical reviews are really important. We want to work hand in hand with our customer to demonstrate that we're developing a very good, high quality product. But the way that we've planned out to execute these technical reviews is an iterative way, and then you can lay that out in your RFP. We've seen a lot of good response, and it's worked for other clients. Also, identify benefits of increased customer involvement. Absolutely. So if you're going to use an agile approach to developing the product, then of course you want to highlight that approach in your response to the RFP, and you want to identify, yes, you do need more customer involvement, and here's where and how you expect the customer to be involved. But more importantly, or as importantly, it's the benefit. So how are you going to get benefit? Why is this the best approach? And then the second thing that we see is that you actually are responding to an agile RFP. So sometimes this is very good. If you're a contractor who already is very agile, this is perfect. Then you just describe your
more and more too. We get called in oftentimes with the other side, which is like there's a prime contractor who hasn't tried, using any type of agile techniques.
Right.
And they have, to respond and adapt, adapt some of these agile principles. So that's also interesting to see now.
Yeah, it is. So, yeah, we've seen both sides of the coins where, okay, of course, it's a great match. If it's an Agile RFP and you're an Agile company, great. But what if you're not that Agile yet, or you're still kind of early on in your Agile journey? So, in this case, if the customer really understands Agile, then of course, then it would make sense that the RFP asks for more sophisticated Agile development language and for you to describe the approach. So some of the things that we have highlighted for contractors to really focus on when they're writing, responding, is to talk about what is the framework. Are you using, if you're using Scrum at Scale or SAFe or some other type of framework, what is the framework and development techniques that you're planning to use? What is the approach going to be for your iterative planning? Like, especially if there's earned value requirements on the contract, then what's the approach and a good map for that? Talking about the process for architecture. So Jessica was mentioning hardware, software, firmware, and talking about the interfaces, how that reduces interdependencies, just describing that approach. If you're talking about modularity and system architecture and agile ways, then obviously you're going to have a leg up in winning an agile RFP or agile contract. Approach to system test and delivery. So those of you that are Agilists know that testing is integrated throughout all of the sprints and releases, and you're constantly doing some type of test. You have a test in mind as you're, going through the execution of the project. And so talking about that approach as well as the system level test and how you're going to deliver is really important. I think we already talked about the iterative system technical review approach. And then Agile metrics. So we have not touched on that much this time. So maybe next Friday we'll get to talk about metrics a lot more. But there are a wealth of metrics available. And good Agile companies will choose the best metrics that support the outcomes that they want. And so having a good set of metrics identified and being able to communicate which metrics you're planning to use so that you can have a predictable forecast and get better outcomes would be great to include in your response to the RFP. And then, of course, your approach for providing the government that early insight into the development process. So yes, we have earned value, and that definitely provides some insight into the process, but being Agile really gives you a lot more insight, and the government will have more information earlier to help. So I showed.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was going to add that for those of you who are actually the customer on this call, because I know some of you are, I would encourage you to take note of this list, because we get asked all the time by those that are in a customer role, like Navy, other organizations, that, hey, what are the things I should ask for? Well, these are the things you should ask for if you really want to encourage them to approach this in an agile way, because most of these things are going to, I don't want to say force agility, but you can't fake these things. If you're not agile, it'd be really, really hard to respond to something like this and win a contract. So, suggestion.
Yeah, so I love to help. I love to help respond to RFPs. We've done it lots of times, from breaking down the scope and helping contractors organize their product backlog, and it's something that I really like to do. And we do see quite the difference between agile RFPs and really agile RFPs. And yeah, that's great. So we can definitely help you if you are trying to respond to an RFP. We can help write your process in a way that really showcases how you're agile at your organization. We put this picture up just to show you some of the teams, some of the people that we've worked with over the past year. And yeah, we have a lot of fun with it, and we'd love to help you. So let us know, and great.
So one of the things I want to show you guys is we are going to delete the product backlog and integrating with EVMS column, because we covered that today. And we're also going to delete introduction to Agile, because we covered that as well today. We covered the creating let's see, what was it, Denise? I gotta remember. Oh, we did Agile and EVMS Performance Measurement and developing a product backlog and integrating with EV. So I'm going to remove those. The next webinar, you'll have the remaining choices, and you could revote on which topics are most important to you. Some of the cool topics we have left are requirements, relationships between story points and hours, which is hugely important for things like your basis of estimate, your BCWS. And we're going to talk about Agile techniques for getting those estimates, large scale estimates we call them. Also, another complex topic would be the Agile product architecture. So how do you get product owners to help you create an architecture that's flexible and adaptive and modular in nature? We're going to talk about that. And if you don't have a background where you are maybe proficient in Scrum or Kanban, there's also that still out there. And I'd like to just put one last plug in the fact that Denise and I do have a Scrum Master and a Product Owner class. We're actually one of the few people in the world who are Jeff Sutherland, the co-founder of Scrum's licensed Scrum trainers. So we do a lot with that as well. So do we need to sign up again to attend next week? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include anyone who was on today's webinar and whoever in addition signed up for day 2. So I think we have roughly 130 people who signed up. I expect about half of them will probably show up, and we'll open it up and give you guys 5 minutes again to re-vote on the top 3 things that you're most interested in. And we'll take into account the fact that some of these topics should be covered a little bit before others. So Lisa, it looks like your hand's up. Did you have a question? No, I probably put you on the spot though. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. Yeah, I really appreciate Empower and For Project and them sponsoring this and sending them out. I know a lot of you got invited through those 2 tools and our partners. So we're very excited to be partners with them. And we hope that you will also consider, if you haven't used those tools, setting up a tool demo. So I've sent you my email several times. There's a lot that we can offer to help you guys on your journey to agility and especially integrating with earned value. So I hope you got to see that today. We hope to see you for the next webinar series. And I hope you guys have a great weekend.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye, guys. You'll receive a copy of the recording of the webinar 1 hour after this finishes, and you'll also be asked to fill out a survey. Please do that when you leave. You close the window and then it will pop up and ask you how we did. So thank you guys.